When I was a teenager, I never questioned that I would get a car. I just assumed that I would get a car. Never really even thought about it. And I figured it would be a pretty cool car because my dad always had the coolest cars. Even my mom had cool cars too. She loved to have her Mustang when I was growing up. We had Trans Ams, we had Camaros. My dad had a really unfortunate spell trying to acquire a GTO. In fact, he didn't get the GTO. He got an old Le Mans, which had almost the same exact body as the GTO. So he took the front bumper off of the Le Mans, bought a bumper for a GTO, put it on the front of the Le Mans, and changed all of the labels on the car from Le Mans to GTO. So I just assumed, I'm going to have a pretty cool car. I didn't think twice about it. I don't remember stressing about how am I going to get a car, how am I going to pay for a car. When I was a teenager, I was entitled, and I thought that I deserved to have everything handed to me. And so I just assumed the car was going to be part of that process. And I did get a car. My very first car was a 1985 Thunderbird. And now you may hear the word Thunderbird and think back to the 1950s and the 1960s and go, man, that's a really cool car. When I first saw the Thunderbird in the driveway, I didn't say anything, but I just kind of felt my heart sink a little bit because it wasn't the muscle car that I thought I was just entitled to have. That lasted for about 10 seconds. After I went, wait, this is my car. Like, I can go places now. I can do things. I am independent. I was thrilled to have my car. Now, my dad had put a lot of work into this car. He usually would do all of his own work on his cars, but for this one, he sent it to a shop, had a new engine put in it, a new paint job put on it. He made sure the interior was clean. He wanted to really make sure that I had something nice. And the only thing about this car is that it had a digital dashboard. Now, nowadays, that's not a big deal. Almost every dashboard is digital in some way, but in the 1980s, this was a really big deal. It was a fairly new feature. Computers, in the sense that we know them, were not very common, and that was the only thing that didn't work. So having no digital dashboard meant I never knew how fast I was going. I had no indicator lights. I didn't have a gas gauge that functioned. I had none of those things that you see on the dashboard that give you really important information. So I learned some tricks along the way. Like if I had my windows down, I could just about tell how fast I was going depending on how my hair was moving in the breeze. You kind of learn to stick with traffic so that way cops don't notice whether or not you're speeding as much. And you learned how to do some math, so that way you'd put a full tank of gas in, and if you knew your gas mileage, you could at least see how many miles you put on before you were about to run out of gas. So I made it work. Didn't really mind that the dashboard didn't work. It had a working radio. I could put CDs in. I could go places with my friends. And it was glorious. Little red car. Just took myself everywhere that I possibly could. And nothing was more fun to me than driving with my best friend Jamie and just like having a grand old time, just listening to great music. And we didn't have a lot to do in the town that we grew up, so we drove around a lot and just would sing at the top of our lungs and go explore side streets. We weren't getting into trouble. We were just cruising, just driving around. So one night, Jamie and I are driving home, and we're on one of the main thoroughfares, and we're maybe 10-15 minutes from my house. She was coming over to stay the night, and we were going to hang out, and when we get about halfway through that 15-minute last stretch, my digital dashboard comes on, and I was flabbergasted. I'm like, the dashboard doesn't work. Why is it on all of a sudden? But when it popped on, every light came on. Every warning indicator came on. It was like a Christmas tree had just landed in front of my face, and Jamie and I are just stunned. We have no idea what's about to happen. So I get to the red light, And I'm getting nervous because, man, this car never had a dashboard. And cars don't just suddenly get dashboards. That's not how this works. Red light changes to green. I hit the gas pedal, and I don't move. The car goes nowhere. And it felt like an eternity. It was like time was slow motion. But in that, 2 to 3 seconds, I hear a big noise, and I see a giant mushroom cloud of smoke erupt from my engine compartment. In my mind, this mushroom cloud of smoke, that erupted from the engine, in my mind, it was the size of like a bomb going off. It just seemed to take up my whole field of vision. And the car just stopped. Nothing. Crickets. Wouldn't move, turned off, couldn't get it to turn back on, and at this point, we are stuck in the turn lane for a very major intersection at 10 or 11 o'clock at night. Luckily, I had a cell phone, not very common to have in the late 90s, but I had a little tiny cell phone, and I called my mom. I said, "Mom, I'm stuck, and I know Dad's not going to wake up because he sleeps hard, and I need to get home." So we got my car off to a parking lot on the side of the road, and we got taken home. And I never saw the car again. The engine had exploded because it lacked water. And my dad got very accusatory. He's like, "Why didn't you notice? There would have been smoke before it exploded. Why didn't you notice any smoke beforehand?" And I'm like, "Dad, I was driving. It was nighttime. You're not going to see a tiny amount of smoke in the country roads at night." He's like, "No, you should have seen it." And he's like, "Well, why didn't you watch your temperature gauge?" "Because the dashboard doesn't work. If the dashboard doesn't work, the temperature gauge doesn't work. I had no indicator." He's like, "Well, what if the check engine light came on?" I said, "When the check engine light came on, all the other lights came on, and it was too late. The car blew up." I said, "I literally had no clue what was about to happen." "Why aren't you checking your fluids?" "I didn't know I was supposed to check my fluids. I was 16. I didn't know." And for almost 10 years, I would say 8 years. We'll go with 8 years. For 8 years, almost every time I spoke to him, he would give me absolute grief about it. Just grilling me. "Well, if you would have seen the smoke, your car wouldn't have blown up." And my second car, I got a replacement car because my family didn't have the ability to drive me all the places I needed to be by that point. So I got the second car was, real awful. It was an old Sunbird. It didn't have any paint on it. I think we paid $500 for it. It was awful. It was literally just enough to get me by. So 8 years after I blow up the car, my dad is very, very ill. And he is literally on his deathbed. And I don't tell you that to make the story sad. It's fine. It was a natural part of what was going to happen in his life. I'm fine, so don't worry about that. But anyway, so he's on his deathbed. And I'm sitting with him. And I'm like, "Dad, I didn't blow up that car on purpose." And my dad has the strangest sense of humor. And he just looks at me, and he is like, "I've known all along it wasn't your fault." And I lost my mind. You were going to let me believe this? You were going to die and let me think that it was my fault that I blew up a car that was a gift from you that I knew you had worked hard on? He's like, "Yeah, I thought about taking that one to my grave, but I figured I'd let you know it wasn't your fault." I said, "Oh, well, thanks for letting me know." So what had apparently had happened, and they discovered this after picking up the car when it blew up, is that going from your cooling system in the car, the things that keep the engine cool, there are some hoses that connect into the engine block. And apparently the hoses that the guys had installed on my engine when they put the new engine in, they didn't tighten them. And so that night, when the car blew up and I thought I was going to die, the hoses had fallen off the engine. But the thing is, my dad knew that for 8 years. And he let me think that I blew up my car. But you know what? I learned some lessons. Your car needs 3 things to run properly. It needs water or coolant. It needs oil. 4 things. It needs gasoline, of course. And it needs air. And if it doesn't have those 4 things in the engine compartment, you're not going anywhere. And so I learned some lessons about checking my fluids. Now, I think we could have just had a lecture about checking my fluids before I blew up the car, but that is not the way my father liked to operate sometimes. So that's the story of my first car. I blew it up. Now here's the real linchpin of the situation. When I was learning how to drive, I refused to learn how to drive a stick shift. And my dad thought I was just being difficult, but the reality was that whenever my dad tried to teach me something new, I would get really self-conscious and really defensive, and it would end up causing friction and struggle between us, and we just stopped understanding each other. So I didn't want to learn how to drive the stick shift because I didn't want to be in a situation where he was teaching me and then I was getting into fights. So I said, no, I'm not going to learn how to drive a stick shift. And it was too bad because he had almost purchased me a mint green 1964 Mustang. And so if I had just been willing to be uncomfortable and learn how to do something I didn't know how to do, I would have ended up with the muscle car that I thought I was getting in the first place. But instead, I blew up an '85 Thunderbird. We'll catch you guys next week. Now I'm going to do that thing at the end of videos that they usually do. We're so close to having 100 subscribers, and if I get 100 subscribers, I can get a custom URL for the channel. So I'd be really grateful if you could hit subscribe, and even more grateful if you could share this podcast channel with one of your friends. We'll see you next week.